Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Art in the Wild. On this episode, I spoke with Matt Bruce, who is a hobbyist photographer based in Northern Florida. He's had a lifelong passion for birds, and he shares that passion with other people through leading birding walks or teaching birding classes or donating his images to conservation initiatives. And he started his photography journey 20 years ago, which is like almost as long as I've been alive, which is pretty crazy. So he's been doing it for quite some time, and he shoots in a multitude of styles, but he particularly enjoys images that have a sense of serenity and place. On this episode, we discussed playback, right? If you don't know what playback is, it's when you utilize a bird call to bring a bird into an area and photograph it, and we discuss the ethical implications of that. Now, while you're listening to this, do keep in mind that I'm not a biologist or an ornithologist or anything of that of that nature, right? I just wanted to discuss with another wildlife photographer to get some thoughts out there, but this is a topic I'm going to want to flesh out significantly more in the future with someone who is a biologist or an ornithologist or something like that to just discuss the topic in a much more scientific sense. But in the episode itself, at first we just talked about Matt, right? We talked about how he got into photography, what gear he brings into the field, his style, things like that. And then as we transitioned into the playback elements, we both kind of gave our takes on playback and its utilization and how we feel about it given fluctuating circumstances and implementations. We also talked about playback being utilized in the ecotourism industry, and particularly in areas where the ecosystem is under threat from logging or deforestation or something along those lines, where the ecotourism industry is actually protecting the ecosystem. We also talked about the ethical differentiation between wildlife-based science and wildlife photography, and playback being used in those two different arenas. That overall topic, not the playback necessarily, but just the difference between wildlife science and wildlife photography is something I'm probably going to make an episode on later. But yeah, it was a good episode. I had a lot of fun. Matt's a super cool guy. He was a lot of fun to talk to, and I hope you guys enjoyed the episode as much as I did. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Art in the Wild. I hope you guys are doing good. I'm here with Matt Bruce today. Matt, how are you doing?
Doing great. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. I must say, before we get into the episode, I'm a little jealous of you Floridians right now because I just wrapped up my trip down there. Dude, like there shouldn't be little blue herons on the sidewalk just in the city. That should be illegal. You know what I'm saying? It's like white
Yeah, you got
ibises.
spoiled.
I did, yeah. And
Well, I look at those like northern hawk owls and stuff, and I think the same thing. So I guess the grass is always greener on the other side, isn't it?
For sure, definitely. Yeah, it was a really crazy experience. I don't know, is I was more south, we were talking before the show, kind of like in the Bradenton area. Is that similar to where you are? I know you're a little more up north. Like, do you guys get this like similar
It's
amounts of birds?
it's similar. It's similar. That's kind of a sweet spot where you start to go from some of like up here. It's a lot of longleaf flatwoods and oak hammocks and
Mhm.
broadleaf forest. It looks a lot more like Georgia or Alabama, like where I am. And then you start to go south, and I would guess I would say around Bradenton, Sarasota is when it starts to look a little bit more like South Florida. It doesn't freeze as often down there, so a lot of those kind of tropical and subtropical plants do a little bit better down there. So
Mhm.
you get into some different habitat types down there. Coming up to where I am in North Florida, it's a lot more like being in the rest of the Southeast.
Yeah, for sure. Do you guys get the Florida scrub jays up there?
Not like in my county. There are some maybe a couple hours to the east of me, but it's not something I can go out on a weekend and easily see.
Yeah. I that was one of the birds I didn't get when I was out there. They were in the area. I wasn't really able to hit any of the spots specifically for them though. And then what else? There was a few things I also didn't see. I didn't get a tricolored heron, which I thought was super weird. I thought they would have been everywhere, from the images I
Usually they
see.
are. Yeah, but that's just the way it goes. Yeah,
Yeah, have you
I'll do like some Christmas bird counts, and I won't even I'll miss something stupid like a chickadee. So
Yeah.
it happens.
Yeah, I didn't even see any chickadees down in in Bradenton area. You know what? I was now that I think about it, because I'm used to seeing them everywhere I go in the country, but
Yeah, well, it sounds like you're around wetlands and beaches and stuff, so
Mhm.
I'm not
Yeah.
surprised.
Yeah. Have you been in Florida your whole like life, or did you move there?
I moved to Florida when I was yeah, probably going into like the fourth or fifth grade. So
Mhm.
that was like 25 years ago.
Okay, I got you. Yeah. And was that still the same area, or did you like go to a different area and then shift around?
I've moved around a bit. When I was a kid, I was over like on the east coast of the state near like Daytona, Volusia County, that area.
Okay, I got you.
So like north of Merritt Island, like a lot of birders and bird photographers might know where like Merritt Island is. So a little bit north of there. And I've lived, let's see, other than that, a couple other spots like briefly for like a matter of months, but mainly just there and over here in the like the Gainesville, Florida area.
Mhm.
And one thing people might recognize my area for is snail kites, because it's probably the farthest north location where you can see snail kites. And at least in the last year or two, it's been one of the best places, in my opinion, in the world to go and photograph them because they've been really predictable, really tolerant of people. You can get pretty close to them, become land like right next to you.
Mhm.
Um, so that's like something if people have been seeing a lot of snail kite pictures on Instagram, is the chances are, they may have been photographed right here in my county.
That's sweet. Yeah, I can think of a few photographers who have been posting some banger snail kite shots. They're gorgeous birds too, you know.
They
Uh
are.
like yeah, I'd love to see one. Also a swallowtailed kite, that'd be awesome. Now you moved to Florida, you know, when you were like a kid and you've been bouncing around, but what specifically got you into like animals and wildlife photography? Like, was there a specific moment that happened where you're like, okay, I absolutely have to do this now, or was it more kind of a gradual progression?
I wish I had like a cool Sparkbird story. I'm always jealous of that. But I was like, my parents were both birders and nature enthusiasts, that kind of thing. And I just kind of was raised that way and kind of grew up with it. So, I was always around that. We always had like we always lived on a little bit of land in the country, and had bird feeders, and my parents were always you know uh into like traveling around and looking at different birds. They weren't photographers. My dad dabbled in it a little bit, but I started off doing actually a little bit of like wood burning and illustrating and painting when I was a kid, of birds. And eventually I ended up picking up a camera, probably around 1999 2000. I got into like an SLR, like an interchangeable lens camera, and started taking it more serious. Got books on the subject, read all kind of books on it, and shot film for a few years, progressed to digital a little bit there later on, and it just kind of grew and grew.
That's awesome. When you were shooting film, were you doing wildlife specifically, or was it just more general?
A mix, but more birds than anything. I've always been fond of birds.
Yeah.
But yeah, and it was tougher back then, because if you could only afford like an f5.6 or f6.3 lens, and your film, nobody was really shooting above ISO 400, maybe 800. 1600 ISO film existed, but you wouldn't want to use it.
Mhm.
So if you have like entry level gear, and you've got this film that you're at usually between 1 to 400 ISO, and a roll of 36 exposures costs you like 9 or 10 bucks between purchasing it and developing it, and then you don't
Crazy.
see your results for like 3 or 4 days afterwards. It's tough to enjoy the hobby as much. It's tough to learn as quickly as you can learn now. But yeah, I was shooting birds back then, but I sucked at it, because the learning curve is so steep with film, and
Yeah.
it wasn't until I got into digital that I started to get a little bit better. And like when I was in high school, I'd say, before you've got full-time jobs and bills, and you got to pay rent and all that, um, I was able to spend a lot of time kind of honing my creativity and getting better at photography, in multiple genres. Usually I was into like nature-based photography, but birds has always been my favorite.
Mhm.
But I took it more seriously like before I had real like adult responsibilities, and then I ended up going to college and working at the same time, and just having no time to focus on hobbies at all. I joined the military, was in the military for a few years, got out of the military, went back to school to finish my degree, and I was working again. So I had almost no time for like a dozen years.
Yeah,
Between when I
yeah.
was in high school and maybe 5 years ago, I had like very little time to focus on it. But luckily, once I kind of got a little bit more established and settled down, I've been able to get out just about every day and really take it serious again.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I can. I'm thankful I didn't have to do the whole film step. I talk to photographers that were doing that. When I started 9 or 10 years ago, when I was 11 or 12, something like that, and I had a digital, and all the photographers were like, "Oh, you should have been here during the film days," and I'm like, "No, thank you. Like, I don't want to
Yeah, you
have to
didn't you
deal."
didn't miss a lot.
Exactly. Yeah, but it's weird now because now I'm going out and there's these kids and they're like, oh, I've never shot a DSLR. I've only shot mirrorless cameras. And it's just like, wow. It feels very very strange. But it's good that you're able to get out like almost every day now. What camera are you running right now? What's your setup?
I use two bodies. I've got an R5 and an R6 Mark II.
Mhm.
And I've got a Sigma. I can show it to you, but your listeners aren't gonna be able to see it. But a Sigma 500 millimeter f4
Oh.
that I use for a lot of my work, and then I've got like just a 150 to 600 that I use for a ton of stuff. I've got like the really heavy sports version.
Mhm.
Um, and aside from that, one of my favorite lenses is just my 24 to 105. This guy right here, because you can get some of those wide landscape shots, and when you can get close enough to a bird or animal, I love to use that. But yeah, I would say nowadays it's roughly like 60-70% on the 500 f4, and the rest between those other couple lenses, and then a few other, for some specialty projects, I use like a macro lens or a couple other prime lenses, that kind of thing.
Yeah. How do you like that Sigma 500 f4? Because I was shooting with a kid in Alaska a few years, like 2 years ago, and he had one. I didn't even know it existed until I saw it. So, like, do you like it? Is it sharp?
I
Like
love it.
everything?
I
Yeah.
love it. It is super sharp. I looked into all kind of tests and comparisons on YouTube and reviews and all that kind of thing before I bought it, and it looks like I think the sharpness is a little bit better was the consensus than like the old Nikon 500, the heavy one.
Mhm.
Maybe a little bit better than the older Canon 500, maybe not quite as sharp, like almost as sharp, but not as quite as sharp as like the newest Canon 500. But
Oh, wow.
I mean, at that point, you're just splitting hairs.
Yeah.
It'll take a 1.42x teleconverter really well. It resolves like 100% of my 24 megapixel like R6 that I use on for most of my bird stuff. So it's been great. Autofocus has been great. It has a few quirks that, like, if and it might just be a mirrorless thing. Like if you are trying to focus on a bird using autofocus, you have to be really close. Like I'm always racking focus manually. It's just something I've always done. So I'll rack focus manually to get close, and then I'll punch in the autofocus. I use back
Mhm.
button autofocus, and I'll just kind of use that to grab the really exact focus on the bird. But I'm always racking focus to get close. If you were somebody who is always using autofocus and relying on that all the time, and you're not like somebody who turns the manual focus wheel, I think you'd hate it. But I suspect it probably has a harder time grabbing a subject that's a little bit out of focus than maybe like a Canon or like a native Canon or Nikon lens would. But it doesn't bother me at all. That's like the one quirk I would mention for anybody out there thinking about getting it. But for me, it's a non-issue. But the image quality is fantastic. It's great in backlight. Like a lot of lenses you'll use, even a lot of my Canon lenses, you'll get like chroma smearing and color fringing and all kinds of stuff. But all my Sigma lenses have been fantastic shooting in backlight. And I love the colors that come out of them too, the way they render color.
Yeah, Sigma is really solid. And I was shooting on the 150 to 600 contemporary for a while. And like you were saying, like it's splitting hairs once you get to a certain point of sharpness. Like that's definitely true because I used to shoot on the, Sigma 150 to 600 contemporary and the Nikon D500. And my shots weren't, I couldn't be too picky about sharpness to say at least. And don't get me wrong, like I loved the contemporary. It was a really good lens for the price. But, once I got like the 500 PF, and then I hear people like saying, oh, this prime is sharper than this one and blah, blah, blah. But you just do a basic kind of look test and they look the same. Like there's no
Yeah, like
real
looking
difference.
at the image globally, like most people are going to,
Mhm.
you have to like pixel peep to see the difference on a lot of those. And what I'll say about my zoom, I've got the heavy expensive version of that lens you were using, like of the sport version. And I don't think the sharpness is probably any better. It can be extremely sharp, but it's not as consistent as like a really good prime lens or something like that. Like you take a series of shots and they're not all going to be in like tack sharp focus. There might be some that are off, and when you get into low light, the consistency of the contrast and the sharpness seems to drop a bit compared to a good prime.
Mhm.
But overall, for the versatility, I just love using that zoom lens.
For sure, yeah. I got the 500 PF and I still have my Sigma 150-600, but I haven't been using it. But I really do miss that versatility. Like being able to zoom in or out, like all of my shots in the 500 PF kind of have the same feel. And I'm really looking at
Hmm.
either I don't know if I want to put my old Sigma on my camera. But maybe getting the new Nikon, what is it, 180 to 600 with the internal
Yeah,
zoom
yeah,
or
that
something
looks
like
like an
that.
awesome lens.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It looks sharp. I've done some basic tests with it. I don't have it, but with ones at like shows or things like that, and it looks sharp to me. So I think it's a solid lens. Like I'm thinking about getting it. I might want to get like a mid range one first, so like a 70 to 200. Also, what you're saying about like the difficulty with the focus with the camera. I don't think that's necessarily just a lens issue. I think mirrorless in general kind of has like I've had issues with my Z9. It really likes locking on the background. And if I don't, I do the same thing that you do. I use, the manual focus ring and then like I'll try to do it on auto first, but if I miss, then I have to use
Hmm.
the manual focus ring and then punch it in again and get it. Because if I don't, it's gonna just like lock on that background. It's not gonna move.
Yeah, I've heard other complaints about that. And I don't. There might be different degrees of it. Like maybe some lenses and cameras are going to pair better on for that. But yeah, I think it is by and large a mirrorless thing. But I'll tell you how I kind of approach the zoom versus the prime situation. Like, if I'm going to go to any wide open space, like anything where there might be any potential to zoom out and get something scenic and include some pretty habitat. Um, if it's a place like that and there's going to be nice the potential for nice light like pretty skies, something like that, I will every time take my zoom lens because there's the potential to be able to zoom out and grab maybe a pretty sky or get some of that landscape. If it's going to be like an overcast day, that doesn't usually look very good if you zoom out, and you're trying to include a scene. Depending on where you are, maybe in a forest situation, it would look good or what have you. But if I'm going to a wide open space with potential for scenic shots, like environment, like small and frame, that kind of thing, and there's going to be nice, pretty skies and pretty light, then I'll every time I'll take my zoom. If I'm going to go into a forest, especially like around here, our forests by and large are really dense with vine tangles and just not you wouldn't want to zoom out a whole lot in most of our forests. So that plus it being lower light, I'm going usually. I get out there usually before the sun rises, and I'm there for like parts of blue hour and the first hour of the day, something like that. And when you're under a tree canopy in that time of day, trying to shoot at f6.3, it's tough. So I pretty much always take the prime if I'm going into most of the like woodlands around here. But that's pretty much how I approach it. It's great to have both. They're both tools that are for, their specific purposes. I think that 180 to 600 looks like a great bet. I wish it like zoomed out a little bit more. I always
Yeah.
have been envious of that 60 to 600 Sigma. It's super heavy. I don't think I'd get one because if anything, I'd like to get something a little bit lighter weight so I can have a zoom and a prime with me in the field, and that way I'm ready for anything.
Mhm.
Um, but what I do now, even if I don't take my telephotos, like my big Sigma zoom, I'll take my little Canon 24 to 105 and I'll put it in a little fanny pack. And that way I've got, up to 105, I can get decent shots of a lot of bigger birds, medium-sized birds, like even grackles sometimes, or cranes and egrets and that kind of thing. I can get decent like environmental small and frame shots of those guys with my little kit lens. So if nothing else, I've got that.
Yeah, for sure. It's good to have more options when you're out in the field, because being like stuck with just the prime and then all of a sudden something comes really close and you could get like a wide angle or more, a mid-range shot of it, and then you're just kind of screwed. You have to watch it because it's inside your minimal focusing distance. So you can't do anything about it. So that's definitely less than ideal.
Well, on that note, I one thing I'd never leave the house without, if I'm leaving the house for photography, that is a 36 millimeter extension tube.
Mhm.
Because I've had those times, and pretty much any time I'm photographing songbirds, I will throw that extension tube on because it'll focus out. I mean, it limits your maximum focus distance, but it decreases your minimum focus distance.
Oh,
So
nice.
with that extension tube, I can shoot my either one of my bigger telephotos, and basically, if the bird is beyond that maximum focus distance, it's going to be too small no matter what in the frame.
Mhm.
But if that bird is comes maybe a couple feet closer than my lens's normal minimum focus distance, I can still focus on it. So it'll take my Sigma zoom, my big Sigma zoom. It'll take the minimum focus distance from like 8.5 feet down to something closer to like 5 feet.
Oh, wow.
And with my 500 prime, it'll take the minimum focus down from like 11.5 feet to I think it's like 8.5 feet. So it's a quite a difference. It's not often that songbirds will come closer than that to you. It happens, but not too
Mhm.
often.
That's a good tip. That's pretty cool. Yeah, it happens with like your songbirds and your shorebirds. It's just like if it happens, you want to be able to draw back there. So that was a really good like detailed description of like how you pick gear when you're going out in the field, and kind of going off of that. Your style is like very distinct. You have very good work, I must say. And when you started, I'm imagining like everyone starts kind of in like a documentary stage of wildlife photography. How did your style kind of progress over the years that you've been shooting to where it is now?
Well, first of all, thanks for the compliment.
No problem.
But yeah, you're right. I did start out just trying to get those, clean portraits of birds, the basic documentation shot. And I went through phases where I was like taking birder shots. So basically, I just want to get an ID shot to put on eBird or something like that. But I guess it was when, like I said earlier, when I was able to start going out on like a almost daily to daily basis and could really start to um, practice the way I wanted to, that I started to have the time to explore some of that stuff. And it's interesting to hear you say I have a distinctive style because I don't even recognize that. In fact, I feel like what I try to do is not have a style. I
Yeah.
try to shoot like a wide variety of types of shots. So I try to mix up my focal lengths. I try to mix up the type of light I'm using, the types of birds I'm shooting. But I would say that I do gravitate toward images that convey a sense of serenity, and images that are more environmental that give you a sense of place. I would say those are
Mhm.
two pretty consistent themes in my photography, but I do try and get like dark dramatic shots sometimes, really tight detail shots and portraits, that kind of thing. Um, and I kind of go through phases too. And, that's the thing about photography. It's so fun to explore every facet of it. Like I might go through a phase where I want to do a lot of silhouettes, or where I want to do a lot of like rimlet stuff, or I want to do a lot of like bright, airy, dreamy stuff. Like you scroll through my Instagram, you'll probably see some of those themes passing through. But yeah, I guess that's it.
Yeah, no, it's like I'm a similar way too. Like I shoot a large variety of things. I'll do a lot of portraits. I try to do a lot of backlit. You just have like some shots, like a lot of your like backlit bokeh shots are like very, kind of like distinct and really cool. And you have a lot of those kind of wider environmental shots. I'm looking at the pulled up this the one he posted on November 7th, the four sandhill cranes, with the sun in the background. It's just like super awesome. Um,
Oh,
but yeah,
thanks. That was one with my little cheapy kit lens, my little 24 to
really.
105.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
funny. It's funny. You see all those reels, and the people are like, "I got this shot with my $10 bajillion lens. Was it worth it?" You know what I'm talking about. And it's like, yeah, like you can get stuff with really good stuff with an expensive lens, but I know people like get amazing images with like taping like a lens to a body, and the lens costs like $50, you know. Um,
Yeah,
yeah, for sure. But
for
like, yeah,
sure.
and were there any like major inspirations to you, like getting into like, you know, I know a lot of people mention like Ray Hennessy and things like that. So were there any people like,
Oh yeah, definitely.
mhm,
Like Ray's definitely been an inspiration, especially in the last few years. When I first got started, that was kind of a golden age for photography, how-to books and stuff. You can hardly even find a bookstore that's in business anymore. But when I first got started, I don't know if have you heard of Arthur Morris?
yeah, mhm,
Yeah, he used to be like really well known and big in photography. So I probably started with his book on I think it's called The Art of Bird Photography. It was published like 20 something years ago. And then John Shaw, he wrote a lot of books. He was a big inspiration. Moose Peterson, Tim Fitzpatrick, Art Wolf, a lot of inspirations early on. And then, nowadays there's so many great people like on Instagram, like you said, Ray has been a great inspiration, especially with his like small and frame, environmental stuff
mhm.
for sure. A lot of people over the years. I don't want to mention too many names, or else I'm going to forget somebody. But
Yeah. No, that's the tough part. Like you want to mention people. I definitely want to throw out one. I feel like a lot of your work, and maybe it's just, you know, because like Florida, but a lot of your work gives off like a Caleb Hoover vibe too.
oh yeah,
Caleb Hoover.
yeah,
Yeah. He's
yeah.
a
I've messaged him I don't know him well, but I've messaged him a few times online. But yeah, he's got some awesome stuff.
yeah, it's really neat how the internet kind of came along and then just kind of democratized all the information in terms of improving like your work. There's because I mean, one like downside obviously to photography back in the film days was it was really hard to do it. Um, but there also wasn't like a lot of competition. Like you'd go to your own spot and there'd be nobody there. And today it's kind of the opposite. Like the barrier to entry is so low that there's a lot of people and so many amazing photographers, but now there's like a lot of I don't want to say competition, but like you go to a spot and it's almost impossible if you're in a populated area to go to a spot that like doesn't have at least a handful of people that are always there photographing. You know what I'm saying?
Well, thankfully, that's not the case here.
That's good. That's really
There
good.
are a couple of spots where you can expect to see one or two people on a given morning, with a camera, but by and large, I see almost nobody when I go out on my daily outings. Depending on where I go, the more popular parks you can see a couple people, and it depends on like the time of the week and stuff. But where I am, there's not a ton of people. I hear those stories like you mentioned, like the Northern Hawk Owl having like tons of photographers around. I never see that kind of thing
Mhm.
where I am, thankfully, and I'm not envious of that situation.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the population density of the area. Like I'm near Boston, and you have the places like near Boston, near like Seattle, near New York City, things like this, where there's a lot of people, and then there just naturally is a lot of wildlife photographers. I think maybe it has something to do with people like being in the city too, and they want to get out of the city and experience
Oh,
wildlife.
sure.
And here it's very tough to find a place that's not being photographed in, to the point where I've actually basically this summer my goal is to just go north into the mountains exclusively for the most part and try to photograph like northern saw-whet owl nests, bears, moose, things like that, because it's just gotten so crazy down where I live. Like there'll be it's funny. And you go to a place where there's not a lot of people. Like I was in Indiana this winter. I went to a short-eared owl location. There's 14 short-eared owls and barely anybody there on this one property.
Wow.
You could look around, there'd be seven of them. But now I have a place like back home where I live now, and there's one short-eared owl that'll hunt this marsh, and there'll be 200 cars lined up trying to photograph it.
Oh my goodness. Wow. I
It's
can't imagine
crazy,
that.
yeah. And with that hawk owl too, like it blew up the day after I was there, which was nuts. You know, it was known in the birding communities, like we were talking about like before, but there was barely any photographers. And then it just the next day, and then that next weekend after, there's like tons and tons of people. But it's crazy. I mean, I've seen some insane crowds, and if you're in an area that's has like you're lucky because you got a place. It doesn't sound like there's like a ton of people around, but like if you're in a place where there's a lot of people, it can be a major issue. And that's kind of what I want to roll into for our next topic, and kind of the main topic of what we're going to be talking about today is ethics. Like I'm gonna make a lot of ethics episodes, like a ton of them on this show, because I find the whole topic very fascinating. But before we get into playback, which is specifically, what we're going to be targeting, what is your general philosophy around ethics? Because I know a lot of people have different angles that they'll approach it from.
Yeah, well, I've sort of evolved a little bit on this subject over the years. And I told you I started like back in the early days of digital, and back then, it was better than film, but you get into the early DSLRs, and the stabilization's not great. The ISO, you can't really go above like 800. And you're usually stuck on like a big tripod. So you didn't have the kind of flexibility with the equipment you do now. So pretty much anybody who wanted to get pictures of songbirds and warblers would have to use a CD player with a speaker, whatever it was back then,
Hmm. Yeah.
to bring them in to get them close. And you'd have like your big flash bracket with your better beamer and whatever. But and it was pretty much accepted back then. There's always been people that have kind of questioned, whether or not that was ethical or not. But I'll be honest, I, was doing a little bit of that too. I've never been like really heavy-handed with playback, anything like that. But as time goes on and equipment improves and people become a little bit more conscious of how that might impact birds. One turning point for me was like Audubon Society, National Audubon Society. They put out a list of ethical guidelines. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. I don't know if you remember that, but
Hmm. Yeah.
one of the things on there was it said to, at first it said, basically don't ever use playback during the breeding season. You use it sparingly during like migration and on overwintering grounds, that kind of thing. So you know, I re- I always appreciate, when there's some kind of governing body or some kind of, institution that is going to give some guidelines out, because you don't want it to be a free for all. So I decided to go ahead and respect, those guidelines, and I followed them. Didn't use playback during breeding season, but I would use a little bit here and there, during migration, because birds, they aren't as responsive, but they will come in, even if it's not breeding season.
Hmm.
And then maybe a couple years ago, they amended those guidelines to basically say no playback should be used. And also a couple of the main bird competitions, like photo competitions. I've been wanting to get into that a little bit more and submit images to photo competitions. And the two main competitions that I can think of for birds, Bird Photographer of the Year and Audubon Societies, uh, they have an annual photo contest too. They both have prohibited the use of playback for birds. So, you know, thinking about sort of the struggles that birds deal with, looking at, if I want to enter these competitions, and just wanted to follow sort of a community guideline, I decided to go ahead and just stop using playback whatsoever for my bird photography. And I'll go into some of the actual reasons why Audubon said, we shouldn't use playback anymore for birds. You think about these birds, and we're talking warblers and tanagers and little songbird wrens, sparrows, those kinds of things people use playback with. And these guys, like especially the wrens and the warblers, they may be migrating down to the tropics. A lot of them are neotropical migrants. They migrate down to the Caribbean, South and Central America, and then they've got to fly like hundreds of miles over the Gulf of Mexico. These guys weigh, most of those warblers, they weigh like, you could mail three of them on a stamp. They're like a third of an ounce, tiny. I mean, if you ever held one in your hand at like a banding station, they weigh like nothing. It feels like you're holding just literally nothing. But they somehow can like fly 600 miles over the Gulf of Mexico, and in the spring migration especially, they make a really rushed migration up to their northern breeding grounds. Depending on the species you're talking about, some of them will stop here in Florida, but most of them keep going north, to some of the more temperate forests, up your way, across Canada, all across, like the Appalachian region, what have you. Depends on the species. And you get these tiny little birds. They've made this rush migration. A lot of them have like started metabolizing their own muscle in order to make this journey back to their breeding grounds. And a lot of them, they don't even make it. Like I went to the Dry Tortugas. I've been there a couple times, but just kayaking around the Dry Tortugas, that's the first land some of these birds come to when they leave from either Cuba or Venezuela or Northern Colombia. They'll hit the Dry Tortugas, and they've gone at least 100 miles over open water. A lot of them more like, 400 or 500, 600 miles, depending on where they started from. And just kayaking around the outside of that island, you'll see all these like swallows and thrushes and things just like floating in the water. They just didn't
Oh,
quite
wow.
make it to land. That's how, like, right on the, like, how little margin they have in terms of like how many calories they've got available to burn. Um, and then they make that rushed migration all the way back to their breeding grounds, and they are pretty well worn out. They are setting up breeding grounds, so you'll see males around, they start singing and selecting a territory. And while they're doing that, these birds are going around and picking up caterpillars and feeding, trying to recover some of that energy that they lost on their northbound migration. And as soon as they kind of build up the calories they need to recover, then they're going to start selecting a nesting site. They're going to start building a nest, laying eggs, sitting on the eggs. So and that is a really vulnerable time. You don't want to be distracting a bird, um, when they've just gotten back to their breeding grounds and they are like half starved. You don't want to bother them when they are, sitting on eggs or building a nest or doing any of these essential functions in life. So I've come to the conclusion that I don't want to do anything to deliberately disturb a bird. Now, anytime we step outside, like I open my front door and I'm likely to spook the sapsucker that pecks on my tree out in front of my house.
Mhm.
You can't be perfect. Anytime you go into the woods, you're going to have some impact, however minor it is. But I've really tried to make it a goal of mine to have the least impact and the lowest disturbance I possibly can, and find ways for the birds to approach me, and not try and lure them to me, get their adrenaline, jacked up, get their blood pressure up when they're looking for a rival male, what have you. Um, you know, Honestly, I spend more time with birds than I do with people, except for my wife. She's always with me.
Yeah.
So I really come to empathize with what they have to deal with, and I spend so much time watching them and learning about them. The last thing I want to do at this point is make my hobby dependent on something that is actively, trying to change their behavior and disturb them and get them worked up. So I have totally strayed away from the playback. I occasionally might make like a, not really even full pitching, but just like a, that kind of sound if I'm trying to get a bird just to turn the head and look at me. But that's the most disturbance that I will ever try and do when I'm in the field at this point. And you do miss opportunities when you do that. There are certain things you have to kind of manage your expectations if you're not going to use playback. But I know I personally feel a lot better about my approach if I go out there, and if a bird, there are ways to sort of anticipate a bird's behavior and have that bird approach you, so that it's all just happening organically and passively, and you're not like forcing anything. And I always, cherish those moments when a bird comes like really close to me, and I it's just because I kind of anticipated. I didn't do anything to push the bird. And a lot of people, you hear people say that, I think most photographers, when approaching shorebirds, for instance, they recognize the same thing. Shorebirds also migrate incredible distances and go through a lot of stress, have, limited and depleted stopover sites, that kind of thing. So I think most photographers recognize that at this point and will, go ahead of the shorebird, crawl, through the mud, try not to disturb anybody, wait for the shorebird to come up to you. You get your shots, you wait for that bird to move off, or you slowly army crawl back the way you came, right?
Mhm.
Um, and, for people that think that you shouldn't do anything to actively disturb shorebirds, that logic seems inconsistent when you go and your only tool in your toolbox for photographing like warblers and other songbirds is playback, which is actively trying to, get them alarmed and try and, trick them into thinking that there is a rival in the area, that kind of thing. Sorry if that's a long-winded answer.
No, it's okay. Yeah. And I totally, yeah, I get the whole shorebird crawl up, get in the way, and then the agonizing crawl back when you realize they're not going to move. So you have to like crawl backwards. I totally get that. One of the workshops I gave a workshop on shorebirds, but one of the talks I just gave was on shorebirds. I talked about how like they need to conserve their energy and stuff. And I think that's a really interesting point, comparing say like the warbler migration to shorebirds, because I think it's pretty widely recognized that shorebirds have to deal with these issues. And I wonder actually how people would feel about shorebird playback on breeding grounds. Because it's not something I see a lot. Like up in Alaska, like let's say you had a not yellow bellied, sorry, a black bellied plover, right? Like if someone were to do playback on that plover's territory, I wonder how people would feel about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you would always have those people that, that's all about the shot and not, and the bird is kind of like not even a consideration.
Mhm.
But I think most of us want to do the right thing, and I think a lot of people just don't realize sort of what birds already deal with. And you see them in a vacuum unless you spend like tons of time with these birds. You go out, you see them, you hear them, you don't really know necessarily when the bird got there, how, what it's up to, exactly what stage of its breeding cycle it's in, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
And it's easy just in a vacuum, not kind of seeing the full context of what that bird's dealing with to not have a problem with playback. But you compare it to like I said, shorebirds, like what you said. Even on the breeding grounds for shorebirds, if you were to do that, I think more people would see that as a bad thing versus warblers. I don't know why that is, but that's my sense just from what I hear from people. I think they would be more up in arms about that.
Yeah, it's weird. There's a lot of, and this is stuff I want to talk about like in further episodes. There's a lot of logical consistencies in ethics across all wildlife photography related fields, not even just bird photography. And I'm going to talk about this in different episodes, but you have like herp photographers, right, who shoot snakes and stuff. Like bird photographers, you can't cause the bird to move, but then if you're photographing a lizard, it's okay to lift up a giant noisy piece of sheet metal and then grab it and stick it on a perch. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
very, yeah, that's a topic for another episode, but it's very interesting to see those kind of differences in logic
Inconsistencies like that.
between logically, it's very difficult for people. I realize like a lot of ethical positions are kind of difficult to maintain with any kind of philosophical consistency because they just apply different standards to different
Hmm.
things, especially when they use kind of
We're
like an
human.
yeah, exactly. But especially when people use like an animal rights perspective versus like a impact-based perspective on ethics, right? Because I know some people approach it from just a respect standpoint of like you should respect the bird, shouldn't do X, Y, and Z, or the animal, I should say. And then other people's are more kind of have an impact base where it's like, well, statistically, if the bird is this likely to not have a successful breeding season, then X behavior is unethical or whatever. And that's other things I'm gonna have to get into on other episodes. But one thing I want, I've never used playback personally. Well, not really. There was one time, one day, where there was this indigo bunting that would perch on this rock, right? This big boulder, and it was blue hour, and the moon was rising, and the sun was still out. It was this nuts scene. And I was like waiting for the bird, and I was like, crap, I'm screw it. I know a bunch of people who use playback. I'm gonna try it. And I hit on my phone. It went through 2 rounds of the call, and I'm like, I'm not doing this. I can't do this. And I turned it off. Um, but then a chipping sparrow came in and landed, which was pretty cool. But yes, I've never really used playback though when I was out shooting, aside from that time, which I kind of stopped doing after like 2 seconds. But I've been with people who use playback. It's a very interesting experience. It feels weird because I was shooting some waterfowl way up north one time, and I was in waders with these guys, and they're like, "Oh, we're just gonna call it in." And I was sitting there, I'm like, "I'm not gonna be like, no, you can't do that." I knew these guys, I'm friends with them, so I'm like, "Okay, we'll see what happens." And they hit a call, and the bird goes under the water and pops up right in front of my waders. Like I could have picked it up. I'm looking at it. I can't shoot it. I'm just looking at its face.
Oh wow.
It was ridiculous. Yeah, it was a grebe species too, in full breeding plumage, right in front of me. And I'm like, dude, what am I supposed to do with this? And then a lot of
Wow.
a lot of people when they're shooting these pass runs, right? So your neotropical migrants, like your warblers and such, when I saw people doing this the first time, and these like a lot of people, like I'm still friends with these people, right? I'm not like angry about it, but it's very interesting to see like what people do is they'll set up a speaker under a perch and they'll do light playback. They don't like turn it on for hours and hours,
Sure.
and but it's very light playback. But they'll be like, I like that perch. I like how the light's hitting it. Hang the speaker under the perch and then stick the bird right on that perch, and it works. Like it works well. And
Yep. It's very
just
tempting to use it for sure.
I remember sitting
It's
there
it's
watching
tempting.
that, and I was like, because I remember, I shoot warblers primarily on migration. I'm probably going to try and shoot them more on breeding ground this summer because they're a little north of me for the most part, so I haven't gone up for them for breeding most of the part. But I'm gonna try to shoot them on migration. Well, I always shoot them on migration, and I would come out every warbler season with maybe like 15 shots. That I'm like pretty happy with, and like 3 or 4 of them, like hell yeah, like let's go. And that was after like
Yeah.
multi 6 hour days on boardwalks on cloudy days, just like trying to shoot and then watching the bird fly out of my frame as soon as you focus. You know how they are, right? And
Yep.
and I'm thinking like all these people who, they're great photographers. Do not get me wrong. Like this is not, I'm not hating on anybody, but I'm like, I see the people who have like in ridiculous warbler portfolios, right? And I'm like, how are these guys doing this? This is crazy. And I see someone, see someone set a speaker up under a little perfect spruce tree and call the bird right to the top of it. And I was like, oh, that's how, you
Hmm.
know, and it's
Yep.
it's interesting. And honestly, it felt like to me that it would take the fun out of it a little bit because I almost
Yeah,
like,
and I agree with you on that. It just feels like it's cheating almost. It feels like and also you can't hardly do it if you have any compassion with the bird, and you you're calling it in, especially if you are having a hard time getting the bird to come to the right spot, and you have to like keep like pausing what you're doing and waiting and let the bird re sort of sensitize to it, and then you play it again, and it's hard not to feel a little guilty when
mhm,
you've pulled the bird away from whatever he was doing and bring him to where you want him. So those kind of shots I never felt as good about
yeah,
anyway. And I like moments to happen organically too. I'd like to, and I'll kind of give a little bit about my approach because there are some alternatives. I mean, you're not gonna you have to manage your expectations because you wouldn't be able to like travel to the New England states and breeding season and say I'm going to photograph, get great shots of 15 different species of warblers in a week. You
mhm,
you couldn't expect that, but if you were going to like travel for warblers, you might be able, or very well might be able to get a number like that if you were to travel to sort of a migration bottleneck, something like Point Pelee in Ontario or McGee Marsh in Ohio, some other places around there,
yeah,
like Dry Tortugas, places around the Gulf Coast, northern Gulf Coast, during fallout conditions. There are ways to sort of plan warbler and songbird trips around those sorts of like bottlenecks during migration. But yeah, if you wanted to like just go out into the woods and say I'm going to photograph 10 warblers today, it's never going to happen without playback. But there are still ways of approaching it and ways of getting shots. Especially if you're not traveling and you're just local. Um, you know, Down here, I will use bird feeders. Sometimes down here, just in my yard, I rarely like take photographs using the bird feeders, but it is an option. I've done it. There's maybe like 2 pictures on my Instagram that I used a bird feeder setup for. But we get pine warblers that come to suet here. We
mhm,
get yellow rumped warblers that come to suet, and yellow throated warblers. So for people that are looking for like an easier option that doesn't like actively pull a bird away and like get its adrenaline running and that kind of thing, there are and bird feeders are a debatable topic too.
yeah, exactly.
But I think you can do it responsibly if you heed any kind of avian influenza guidelines and take them down whenever there's like an outbreak, that kind of thing. That is an option for people. It's not something I do very much of at all. And then you can also, if you can find nests, uh, another could be debatable topic, but I do it in a way that I feel good about. But if you can find a nest and stay a very respectable distance away to where you're getting like maybe medium and frame shots at 500 or 700 millimeters, um, and just being around sort of a nest in the general vicinity, you can get birds that come in and stage, and hunt for insects and that kind of thing. Just within that 150 feet or so of a nest, you'll just get more activity, and I really enjoy that because one is I'm out there, I'm sitting there like a fly on the wall, and I am just observing what these birds do on a daily basis, and it kind of builds that connection for me with nature and with the birds,
Mhm.
rather than creating an artificial situation. And when you do that too, you're when I do it, I collect citizen science data. So like last spring, I'm going to do it again this year. Last spring, I went out and monitored a few prothonotary warbler nests. So what we would do is like watch them really carefully. We follow like a set of guidelines from Cornell University that sponsors it, and we actually will go and count the eggs, document that. We will check and see how many fledge, make notes about the exact nest location and condition of the nest and like height off of the ground. We collect all kinds of data.
Mhm.
And but for the photography, I am extremely cautious not to linger near the nest, or even for like the data collection. We follow a very strict set of guidelines for that. And but it does open up a lot of opportunities if you can go and do that as an informed person that's respectful of the bird and puts the bird before anything else, before a photograph for sure. So I will photograph around nests if I can find them. So that is a method I use. And then a lot of birds, if you just watch them long enough, you will find patterns to what they do. Like down here, we don't get a ton of breeding warblers where I am, but we will get like orange-crowned warblers that come down and they just spend the winter here. And they will set up a feeding territory that's, maybe just a couple acres, and they'll run through the same, few spots over and over again all day, for their whole winter down here. So if you are just patient and can kind of watch the behavior of those birds, you can set yourself up, wherever there are some nice natural perches and backgrounds and nice light, and just wait for the bird to come through. You have to be really quick on your feet because these birds, they're not stopping and singing like they are, when you are on the breeding grounds. They are kind of frenetically hopping from perch to perch and hunting insects like warblers do. So you've got to be really quick on your feet and quick to compose and get the photo. But I think that when you find some of these patterns, and I could give you a million examples of birds like that too, where you can learn their patterns, learn their behaviors, put yourself ahead of them, kind of like you do with shorebirds, but not as straightforward as just like going down the shore from them. There's a
Yeah.
little bit more, of a learning curve to it, and a little bit
Mhm.
more study. But when you do that, I think there is a potential to get shots that other people aren't getting. And I'm not going to say they're better shots. I'm not going to say they're worse shots, but something that's maybe a little bit different. So you might get a shot, like one of the Pythonotarians I posted last year. He's like, or she is standing on the mud with like some pickerel weed kind of framing her. And if you're using playback for a Pythonotary, for instance, you would never photograph one acting like a shorebird. It's just not something you would expect. But if
Yeah.
you just let these moments happen organically, you can really kind of capture some unique stuff that you just would never have thought of or never have planned. Um, but I will acknowledge there are drawbacks, and you're not going to be able to say, okay, I want the bird on that perch. Let me put the speaker there. That's certainly easier, but I feel better about the way I do it, and I will acknowledge there are drawbacks to it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, no, and I get what you're saying too about like getting unnatural behavior that you wouldn't even think of with playback, like getting the bird on the ground, like you're not a lot of the time when people are doing the playback, they're trying to get them on a specific perch. But it's interesting too because I know a lot of people who use it. Like I know a lot of people who use playback that I'm friends with, like not
Mhm.
like adversaries or anything. But it's interesting because a lot of them there's different degrees of playback, right? So I know people who actually like, will use it on a perch to get the bird on that specific perch. But a lot of them they'll use one call, and then the bird comes into the area and then they just stop and the bird keeps foraging, you know. And I think there's varying degrees to how intensely it's actually used. And in terms of my, I don't really have, I'm going to have to make an episode about like my pinned down actual ethical philosophy at the moment, which is will probably change in the future. My ideas are kind of nebulous right now, but I have kind of like an impact based ethical thought process, right? So like if photographer does X action, what is the likelihood that Y negative outcome will occur? You know, and
Oh, sure.
what really helps with that is studies. And I was watching, as we were talking about before the episode, like I didn't have a lot of time to look into these. When I was because I've been traveling and stuff like that. But I was watching a video from a biologist on YouTube. I think it was like one of the first ones where you look up like I think it was called like, is playback actually bad for the birds? And at the end of it, the guy went through a bunch of studies that were out there, and I didn't get a chance to actually, look at them and look through them and stuff in the results. So I'm not gonna like say, exactly what the results were because I couldn't have confirmed them for myself. But basically, the end result of the video is like, we don't know, right? Like, there's a bunch of studies that
Yeah.
have completely conflicting things. Like, one study will have
That's
a,
been what my understanding too is like. I mean, just think about how hard that would be. The only one I can think of offhand is I think there was a study that followed house wrens, and somebody would basically come and like harass the bird with playback, like more than anybody would ever realistically do it. And then they
yeah.
found that the chicks weighed less than they should have, like below a healthy weight or something like that. I
Mhm.
don't know the details of it, but and that was such an unrealistic scenario. It could happen if there's like a rare bird that comes into an area and you've got more like birders coming in trying to see it.
Mhm.
But realistically, I'm with you. I don't want to give the impression that I'm like ardently anti-playback. That's just a personal choice,
Yeah.
and it kind of jives better with my way of spending time in the outdoors and how I enjoy photography.
Mhm.
And I agree that yeah, like if you there's a lot of times where maybe even like an Eastern towhee down here, you could play one call note at like half volume on your phone, and that's going to get the towhee to like pop up onto a stump and start singing or calling. And if you're in an area where you don't have other photographers or birders coming in and doing that, and you just one call, as a one-off, and you play it, and the bird pops up, or just moves into the area, I don't think that has any real impact, And I agree with you. I don't like that sort of like binary thinking that all playback is bad, or all this is bad. There's not always just two black and white sides to an issue.
Mhm.
And I think you're in the right place, that your ideas are kind of nebulous, because I mean it's a nuanced issue.
Yeah.
um, there are really bad ways of doing playback, and there are much more responsible ways of doing playback, and you're right there. My general understanding too is that there aren't any like definitive studies that say that, in the context of like bird photography, that is detrimental to birds. A little bit of common sense would tell you that, if you're coming in and using playback over the course of like 4 hours to get a bird, like
Just
right on the
blasting it on
exact little
repeat
spot to
the whole
get like a
time.
wide
Yeah.
angle, I don't think anybody's putting it like on a loop like that, because the bird would desensitize within 2 minutes.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are people out there who will, you know, play a song, the bird responds, but doesn't come quite to the right spot. Then you've got to kind of wait for a few minutes, let the bird kind of readjust. You play it again, bird comes back. Maybe you're getting frustrated, and the bird still doesn't quite come right in front of your 24 millimeter lens, or whatever you're trying to do. And over the course, that could last for 2, 3, 4 hours. Somebody just kind of playing and pausing, and just keeping this bird occupied for half a day. And and that's one thing that I found frustrating about using playback is, you don't want to use it at all. And sometimes you do get these birds that they are very responsive, but aren't quite going where you want them.
Mhm.
And it is just, I found it to be too tempting to go overboard on the playback. And once you kind of start getting frustrated and getting letting your emotions take over, and not using your rational mind to sort of judge these things, it's too easy to go overboard and overdo it with the playback, and I didn't want that temptation for myself. I don't want to say that people who like we said, just play a song like once and then the bird comes in. I don't want to say that those people are doing anything unethical or that it's objectively wrong to do that.
Mhm.
Just from my perspective, um, I see there's potential that it could be detrimental, especially if you go overboard with it. And like I outlined before, these birds they do deal with a lot before they even get to their breeding grounds. And
Mhm.
I don't want to. I'd rather err on the side of caution. You know what I mean? That's just a personal choice.
Yeah, for sure. I take a kind of a similar approach there. And that's why really I don't use it because when I think about it, I'm like, if you play one call and it comes into an area, I'm really thinking, especially if it's foraging immediately after that call and it's just kind of there, I'm like, that's probably not that bad. But I usually just tend to err on the side of caution with these things. Like, I don't want to accidentally be doing something wrong. But I do think your example of like repetitive use over hours would be one of those examples where it's like, okay, like this is kind of a textbook option of like what we should not be doing. You know what I'm saying? Like it's so because that like a lot of people will be like, playback causes them to waste energy, but then the people who use it lightly will say, well, no, I only play it once, then it forages again. But if you have someone who's playing it over and over again, for hours here and there for the bird to actually come back, like at that point, you're talking about it wasting a lot of energy and not regaining those calories by coming back and kind of challenging that opponent and, well, potential hypothetical opponent for the bird. And one thing too about playback and things like that, I'll kind of take a look at owl ethics here, for example, because this is something I really like to think about a lot. You have the really bad things, like, for example, like the really bad things that an individual can do, like one person can do, which is like baiting an owl near a roadway. Like, that's obviously bad. Like, that's really bad for that specific instance, and it can cause harm by that one individual. But I feel like wildlife photographers in general, like wildlife photographers by themselves or in small groups are great, but when you have a bunch of them together in one area or when they frequent one area a lot, even if everyone's being respectful, it's still kind of a disaster, right? And I feel like you can see that with playback, like, yeah, you could have the one person that plays on a loop 100 times, but if let's say you had a really popular location and everyone who uses that playback is one of the responsible playback users, but there's 100 responsible playback
Yeah,
users.
sure.
Same thing where you have a snowy owl.
Yeah,
Like,
so yeah,
what
I
is it?
think on that note, like if someone is going to use playback, like I said, I'm not 100% adamantly like against playback. I do know a lot of people that use playback, but if you're going to decide to use it and be that more responsible person, part of being that responsible photographer is identifying those locations where people frequent, and it might not be photographers but birders too, because a lot of like
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of birders who will go out to our local marsh and immediately start playing king rail or whatever it is,
Yeah,
to try to see the bird. But part of being as responsible about it as you can is to identify those places and say, okay, I'm just going to go. I'm not going to go to like this urban park where I see birders and photographers all day. I'm going to go out to like a wildlife management area, an hour outside of the city, and where I've never seen anybody but hunters, and
yeah.
that kind of thing would be the more responsible choice for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that's like kind of in a general sense too, just in terms of wildlife photography. Like I think the world of wildlife photography would be a lot better. And I know this is kind of like easier said than done because, people just want to see wildlife and they don't want to put in like the multiple hours to find their own location. But I think the world would be the whole community would be better if everyone went to those random wildlife management areas that don't even have an eBird hotspot. You know what I'm saying? Because there's
Yeah,
stuff there. And if I were to ever use playback, it would probably be like 3 hours north in the mountains, and find a warbler that's like way down some random trail that absolutely is nowhere near an eBird hotspot or anything. Because if you're going to do that, you want to make sure like it's not being affected by a lot of people. Because kind of one of the theories I have about ethics is it's not even the bad things a lot of the times that are the worst. Like you have like, like obviously someone who baits an owl near a roadway or gets, feeds a predatory mammal in a national park and then it gets put down, like the really bad examples. And that happens, but I feel like there's a lot more impact overall occurring when you have just the compounding impact of a lot of people observing an animal, whether that be light playback usage or just like in my area with the snowy owls, like I was trying to say earlier, it's like you have one snowy owl and then you'll have like 100 people, 150 people, and they're all being respectful. They're all keeping the
Hmm.
distance that the rangers want them to stay at, but there's still 150 people looking at this
Yeah,
one owl,
like a
right?
whole audience. Yeah.
Exactly. And it's just sitting there in this half circle of photographers looking around at everybody like, what is going on right now? And yeah, I think in a general sense, especially with playback, like if you're gonna do these things, you kind of need to take it upon yourself to find these locations where you're not gonna run into any, like pretty much anybody else. Because if you
Hmm.
do, then you start dealing with compounding impact that photographers have, and then you're talking about a real possibility of that animal actually being harmed by wildlife photographers.
Oh, for sure. And I know you do a ton more like owl photography than I do, and I mostly my favorite subjects are songbirds, little passerines. But I know that the playback, I mean, the question of using playback is really big among owl photographers too. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on kind of, what. I know you said you never use playback, but how do you feel about other people using playback for that,
Yeah, so with
even in
owls,
remote areas?
yeah, the thing about owls is that they're predatory animals, right? And they're not like eating caterpillars that are under every single leaf. And like keep in mind, like I'm not an ecologist. So like I'm just kind of like my general take on it. But with owls, it takes more energy for them to move, right? They're larger birds. It takes more energy for them to actually move themselves. And then it takes more energy for them to actually get food, right? They're actually out there actively hunting sometimes large prey, and they might miss a lot, right? So typically with owls, I say I just don't like using. I don't really. I think it's worse. Emphasis on the think. It's worse than warblers. Like I'd have to see some studies, but when you have a large owl, a large animal that actually takes a lot of energy to move, and then they're getting, upset, as opposed to a smaller warbler who just kind of has to flit out in the open, sing a little bit, and then like, okay, I'm going to go eat 100 inchworms in like 5 minutes. I do think with some things with playback is like, if you were to use playback to not even see the bird, but just to identify a bird maybe in a certain area. So you don't even play it once every outing. You play it like once at the beginning of the season to see if a bird is there and then never play it again. I think that may be like a quasi acceptable use, right? Like if you were trying to find one example that comes to mind is like maybe like northern saw-whet owls, and it was like a big grove. If you used it like one time to see if there's a saw-whet in there and then never touched it again ever, maybe.
Oh,
Um,
sure. Yeah, there's legitimate reasons for that. Like, if you're collecting citizen science data or something like that, I know you've mentioned eBird on your podcast before, in not using it for certain sensitive species. You can actually mark, you can mark to hide the list from public view.
oh, that's cool.
So you can do that, but that's just a side note. But if you are like I do Christmas bird counts, among other sort of citizen science efforts. And every year we go out at fourth, and I think 4 o'clock in the morning is when we always meet, some crazy hour, and we go and we play great horned owl, screech owl, barred owl, and we go to different spots and count how many we find there, because that is, I mean, it's once a year and it's for a legitimate scientific purpose, and it's collecting data that can then be used to help with conservation. But what we're not doing is, playing it so that they come into a specific spot and have to like tease the bird to do something that we want the bird to do. That's kind of the distinction I see. And I mean, there's so many gray areas of that, like, whether you do just with birds in general, I mean, not specifically owls, but if you do play a tape once and the bird happens to come into a spot you're happy with, or under the perch you've set up, or what have you, it is that impact, any worse than when I go out and do Chris's bird count? I guess the difference is, one is for legitimate scientific sort of purposes, and the other one is for hobby purposes.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, that I guess is the distinction.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, really with science, and I respond to this with people because people are like, oh, well, like they catch solid owls and long-eared owls in nets. Why can't I get up and photograph them right in front of their face? And when you come to like scientific efforts and conservational efforts, there's actually a positive impact being reinvested into the species there. Whereas with photography, a lot of the time, not always, like not always, but a lot of the time it's purely recreational and then like community based, like sharing images and then keeping images. And I hear some image arguments from people about playback, and they're like, well, the images that I get with my, the images I get while using playback can have a really big conservational impact. Sure, but a lot of these people don't then go donate those images to like a cerulean warbler conservation
Sure.
organization or something like that. Like I think if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
if you go out and use light playback on warblers, but then you actually go donate those images to those organizations and you help them out, that may be one thing. But I feel like a lot of people will use the conservational impact of images as kind of like a cop out, but they
An
don't
excuse
actually
to, yeah.
yeah, but they don't actually put
Sure,
any
sure.
effort in themselves to utilize those images in a way that would help conservation. But yeah, I do think your distinction is absolutely correct. Like when it comes to scientific stuff, it's reinvesting positive impacts to the animal, to the species. Whereas with photography, it's purely for human benefit. And when that's largely purely for human benefit, and when that is, detrimental to the bird, it's kind of like good to be avoided.
Yeah, and there's an intersection kind of between those two ideas as well, because it is possible to have people photographing birds recreationally and have a conservation benefit for birds without even, involving nonprofits or something. And what I'm getting at is, you go to the tropics, anywhere in the tropics, tropical forests, and oftentimes the only thing standing between a patch of mature forest being kept intact and people are stewarding it and treating it well and watching for people like coming in that want to log. The only thing standing between it being a nice maintained forest and it becoming a pit mine or having people come in and log it or having it slash and burn and turn into rangeland, the only thing getting in the way of that is ecotourism. So, I go down to South America, Central America, different places, and go to some of these lodges. I always ask, we get a guide. I'll ask, what opportunities can we find that don't require playback that I can do passively, where I can, just like I said, be a fly on the wall.
Mhm.
But a lot of birds, you get like the birders or photographers that care more about, say, the diversity of a portfolio or how many birds are on a life list, that kind of thing. And those eco lodges have guides that know those specific birds, and they'll go out and they will just, they'll know how much playback to use without causing too much harm to the bird because they are personally invested in keeping those birds well.
Mhm.
So in that context, I think having playback as a tool in the tool bag for guides and lodges and ecotourism, especially, I mean, it could apply to some degree in the U.S., but especially down in like the tropics where those forests would be more at risk. Um, Playback, I think, can be a tool to more, to attract more and more people down there to enjoy the land, spend their money with these lodges and in these communities, and prevent ultimately those areas from being bulldozed or turned into whatever, pit mines.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a really good point too. It's like some things, like I hear a lot of complaints about ecotourism just in a general sense, and people are like, oh, they're doing certain things with the animals and yada yada yada. But a lot of these, as you said, in a lot of these situations, the only thing but like keeping this place from being absolutely obliterated and non-existent, becoming non-existent anymore, is the fact that there's a lodge making a boatload of money from birders coming down to look at the birds. And it's similar too with like predatory animals. And this is, I'm gonna have to make another episode as well. But like people will complain about, like ecotourism in areas where there's like large predators and people going down there. And I think there's definitely issues in the ethics of how those things are run, whether you be in like Kabini National Park with uh Bengal tigers or whatever, or somewhere in Africa. But also you have to keep in mind, like, hey, the local people that live there, like I think it was in Patagonia, down there with the mountain lions, like there was a lot of people that would kill the lions when they were not lions, but kill the pumas or whatever you want to call them when they saw them
Sure, they
because
go after the sheep.
exactly. But then when they realize, oh, I can make 100 times more money by showing people this puma than by raising sheep, now you actually have a conservational impact for this predatory
Absolutely.
animal that wasn't really a thing in the past, right? We didn't see that with, wolves or bears. Like they were just kind of getting obliterated until people started appreciating them. And now we're in this situation
Yeah.
where we can actually use that. And like, yeah, there's definitely ethical issues that need to be tackled. And I think that can be addressed in just general large community discussions, particularly in countries like the US or things like that, where these tourists are coming out of. But I would say it's still overall a positive, just given the fact that these areas are being effectively conserved.
Oh, for sure. That was a great example about like those ranches around Torres del Paine down in Patagonia that have those. I guess that some of them are actually sort of baiting the pumas in and that kind of thing. But at
Mhm.
least that land is being more, conserved and is not being overgrazed and it's being used for conservation. I mean, the land's being conserved and there are some trade-offs, there are ethical dilemmas, but we do live in a capitalistic society for better or worse, and
Yeah.
we do have to figure out how to make these trade-offs, make these things work, and it's all about the balance in the end, and how do we make things as best we can for all these critters that we care about.
For sure, yeah, and I think honestly, the way to tackle, the like unethical behavior, like I'm sure you've seen, like in India when they're photographing tigers, you'll see the zoomed out image as opposed to the telephoto portrait, and there's like 25 cars on each side of this tiger as it's trying to cross the road or whatever. And those are things that need to be corrected, like as you're saying, like baiting the pumas. But I think that would just be addressed in overall kind of education and discussion in our own communities from where these tourists are coming from. To kind of have us all agree, like, because if we agree that we're not going to participate in baited situations, then the people that are running these ecotourism things that need these ecotourism systems to survive without actually conflicting with these predators are going to be like, okay, we won't bait them, and then the whole issue is fixed, right? So yeah, we're coming up on an hour. Well, actually, we're a little over an hour. So looping back to the playback thing, was there any final thoughts you had that you wanted to throw out there?
Let's see. I think we pretty much covered it. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I'm definitely what I want to do at some point with more playback episodes is I'd like to get a photographer who uses playback and have them discuss their angle. And then ultimately what I'd really like is to have someone who ran one of those studies that, you see referred to, and then or maybe a few people and actually kind of pick their brains about like the scientific aspect from like a biologist. Because, wildlife photographers, like we can, talk about it and stuff, but a lot of it, especially the factual information when it comes to like extrapolating a moral value, subjective moral value from the data, kind of gets different. But when it comes to just learning about the impact on the bird, I'd really like to get a biologist because they're the ones who actually know the data. You know what I'm saying? But that was a great episode, man. I had a lot of fun, and that was a lot of thoughts I wanted to get out about playback. I was just kind of like spitballing and throwing them out too. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
but yeah, that was a lot of fun. So
Awesome. Well,
yeah,
thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It was fun being on the show. I've been enjoying it, and I hope you can keep them rolling out. I've been enjoying them, and it sounds like you've got plans to do that. So I'm excited to hear what you cover next.
for sure, awesome. Before we end, where could people find you online, like website, Instagram, things like that?
So I am on Instagram at Matt Bruce FL. So that's just like the abbreviation for Florida, Matt Bruce FL. And then I've got a website, birdlifephoto.com, pretty straightforward. And I've got a blog on there. People can read that, sign up for that, photos, and I'll be adding more stuff to that as well. But yeah, those are the two main places.
Sweet. Awesome, man. Well, thank you for coming on. I had a lot of fun. And I want to thank everybody else for listening to this. Yeah, definitely go check out his work. It's incredible. Go to his website, go to his Instagram. And yeah, I will see you guys on the next episode.